So welcome everybody to the Miracle Workers mini conference today. I'm really excited. I'm really excited to welcome you all and yeah, have a really lovely sort of morning sharing our work and what we've done so far on the research project, because we've found out some really interesting things. This is just the welcome slide. I've sort of highlighted a couple of our upcoming talks. I know we mentioned a couple of people were talking about the Great War Huts talk, which is on our YouTube page now, or channel, or will be in a couple of weeks. But these are the upcoming talks that aren't sold out, that the Devil's Porridge are putting on, and they all look really interesting, and you can all find tickets to them, free tickets, on Eventbrite. So this is the conference timetable. It's basically, we're just going to have a nice hour doing short informal talks with some of our volunteers, talking about what they found out about and sharing their research. And then at 11 o'clock, Dr. Chris Brader is going to talk about his research into Gretna munition workers. And Chris wrote his PhD on munition workers at Gretna, and his book Timbertown Girls is absolutely brilliant, and a must read for anybody interested in research at Gretna. Yeah, so just a really short mini conference, a nice little morning of fun historical chat. So the first person up is Fiona. Off you go.
Good morning all. Most of you already know me. I'm never quiet on any of these meetings. I had originally thought when I joined the research project that I would be given a name and I would go away and research an individual who had worked at the factory. But when Dr. Laura Noakes, the research assistant at the museum, mentioned the British Newspaper Archive, that sparked an interest in me, and I asked, well, can I just do general research? So I have spent my time working my way through the British Newspaper Archive, looking for any and all references to HM Factory Gretna and individuals who worked there. Laura, you need to...
There you go.
The British Newspaper Archive is great. There are lots and lots of references to individual people. Sometimes it's just a passing reference in an article naming somebody and their job title. Where I've found the most information has been munitions tribunals, sheriff courts, and the Police Gazette. The Police Gazette even goes down to height, complexion, hair colour for some people, presumably so you can apprehend them quicker. Lots of mentions of the factory, whether it's the cost of the factory. At one point in Parliament, they're talking about it costing in excess of £8 million. Lots of social history, some naming the factory and some just related to women working in munitions works. Even things like product advertisements aimed specifically at women munition workers. Lots and lots of job adverts. The initial jobs, mostly construction jobs, navvies, labourers, lead burners. What I hadn't expected was that the job adverts would be up and down the length of the country. Down in the south, they were looking for policemen, lead burners in the Midlands, big heavy metalworking area, navvies and labourers in Ireland. Even jobs that were female specific. The newspaper research also threw up lots and lots of unusual adverts and stories, plants and flowers, flowering plants for the workers' accommodation, visits from the Russian Parliament. I knew the King and Queen had come in 1917, but not the Russians. Stories about union membership meetings, trying to drive up the membership, them raising grievances, but also stories about the local impact. £16,000 worth of damage to the roads in and around Gretna due to the increased level of traffic and the heavy loads that were on those vehicles. New bus routes, and of course lots of people complaining about loose morals now that the factory had started. Blaspheming in the streets was one of the anonymous letters that appeared. So there was quite a lot to get through. But the biggest lot of adverts were after the factory closed, and they decided to sell off everything. Cars, vans, spare parts, offices, hostels, houses, garments. Some of these sales lasted several days, and it kept being advertised over a number of years. My favourite, as you probably all know, is the advertisement for waterproof knickers, thousands of them. The control board features heavily. People were very interested in what the control board was doing, running the public houses in and around the Gretna area. They had visits from the Liverpool Licensed Victuallers Association, who were very unimpressed with the control board. Too expensive and far too poor quality. Lots of munition tribunals, as I said, lots of facts and figures, particularly from the visit with the King and Queen. 14,000 meals a day produced by the canteen, and 6,000 items of laundry laundered by the laundry. Lots of costs and savings were brought up in Parliament and within newspaper articles, although one person did say the ether plant cost £250,000 to build, and they reckoned at auction it sold for 20,000. So far, I've found over 300 named individuals with job titles who worked at the factory. Lots of information about jobs, the wages that were paid, variety of jobs, and sometimes the numbers. An advert in Southern Ireland for over 100 labourers wanted in one advertisement. And there's obviously a lot more to come. At the moment, I'm still working my way through 1917.
Well, thank you for talking about your research, Fiona. It is so fascinating, not only just like the sheer number of names and job titles that you've discovered, but just those interesting little nuggets of social history. There was, what was that? I love the one where, did a baker put something on a cake that was...
That's right, it's part of the Defence of the Realm Act. What I hadn't realised, it was just a side note, a side story besides something about the factory, and it's the Cakes and Pastry Order of 1917. You're not allowed to decorate anything. There's to be no top dressing. So you could put desiccated coconut in your cake and bake it, but this baker had sold a Madeira cake with desiccated coconut on the top and was fined under the Cakes and Pastries Act for doing so. So that was a whole new one on me. I hadn't realised it was quite so prescriptive.
Absolutely, it's just so fascinating, all of the little things you're finding out. Brilliant, and thank you so much for talking about your newspaper research.
You're welcome.
So next up we have Stuart, who is talking about women's football at HM Factory Gretna, and also Stuart does these amazing colorized photos of the women's football team and women in general, which are absolutely brilliant and just really bring them to life. So over to you, Stuart. Oh, I think you're on mute. Let me unmute you. There we go.
Okay, if you look at the first slide, I mean, women's football is really sort of nothing new. If you look at the next slide, you get an example. It's like the first recorded match dates back to sort of like 18th century. But the first recorded match between the border towns of Wennell and Coldstream. That was held on Ash Wednesday of 1786. So it dates back quite a way. In the next slide, you've got the earliest Women's Association matches. The first one actually took place in Edinburgh in 1881, but there was one in the first one I've been able to find was in Carlisle in 1896. That was a branch of the British Ladies Football Club that came to the town, and they sort of dragged out a sort of dull 0-0 draw. But they played a men's team later in Penrith and won 4-3. And it is noted that the women played better against the men's side than they did against each other. So there might have been a reason for that, but I'm not really sure what it is. But anyway, on to Gretna. Next slide. I mean, once the factories were built up for the producing armaments, women's football became a sort of popular sport amongst the workers. So quite a lot of the sites within Cumberland and Westmoreland all had their different sides, but Gretna had their own. They seemed to be sort of based on different shifts from East Riggs or Mossband. And they played, I think they played in some of the pitches because the social development the recreations department produced quite a few pitches and facilities that were played in those. So in June 1917, that's the next slide, a team calling themselves the Gretna Girls travelled over into Carlisle to play at Brompton Park. One of the players we've been able to identify was Jessie Latimer, who came from Anning, and besides football, she was also involved in singing and performing. As far as I could tell, she was born in 1891 and married an Edinburgh dentist in 1920. So they lived in Grimsby until William died in 1929. Then Jessie moved back to Scotland, where she lived in Lockerbie until her death in 1958. But that's at least one of the players I've been able to identify. The next team that appeared in the next slide was the A shift at Mossband, and they called themselves the Swifts. I think there's a patch of ground next to Mossband. It's called the Swifts, and I think that's what they named themselves after. And they sort of formed during the summer of 1917. One of their first matches with Maryport at a tournament organised for the Alexandra Day Sports Fair. And that's one of the things about the First World War, or women's football connected to the First World War. It was the first women's tournaments started taking place. I think the first one was in Derby in 1916. And it started off sort of small local events, like part of maybe short matches, but sort of slowly built up into big tournaments. And the most famous one, of course, is the Munitionettes Cup out in Tyneside. That's one most people have heard about. But the Mossband is in the next slide. They also travelled over to Carlisle for a match against the local Carlisle side. And another player I've been able to identify, the Miss Anderson. Turns out to be Mary Annie Anderson. She was born in Kilpatrick Fleming, close to Anning, in 1899. And she married Joseph Irving Lightfoot in 1921 and lived in Carlisle until her death in 1976. So when the sort of project started, the hope was that we could identify one of the players. Well, I've got two now, so we're only halfway through. So hopefully we'll get more. The Mossband also played against male sides. That's in the next slides. That was a common match. They play against wounded soldiers or soldiers. Military teams. One of the famous ones was down in Portsmouth, where the men are played with a high tied behind their back. I think there's quite a lot of photographs. You'll be able to find it online quite easy. But there was certainly one of those matches played at Brompton Park. But that photograph, I don't know where that is. We've been trying to identify it, but I don't think it's Carlisle, so it must be another one. But anyway, the last matches played at Gretna that I can see was in August 1918, but there was a small mini tournament against the Broomlands Colliery in Northumberland. but there's no, one of the frustrating things is very few details actually within the newspapers. So it's been a struggle to sort of dig out what we've got. But anyway, at the end of the war, in the last slide, women's football sort of continued on. And one of the most prominent sides in the 1920s was the Greece Ladies. They sort of operated from early 1920, 21 through to the mid-1920s, 1925 or so. And they played around the district. One of the most famous tours was with Dick Kerr, where they actually toured around Scotland. There was even talk of them going to Canada, but the Canadian Football Association put the boot in at the last minute, so that didn't really take place, which is a bit of a shame. But that's a quick run through of women's football in the early part of the century.
Thanks so much, Stuart. And it's like, I can't emphasize how tricky this kind of research is, because we, like as Stuart said, you literally just have Miss and then a surname. So the fact that you've been managed to find two players and sort of trace their life stories is absolutely incredible. And it just gives us so much more kind of context to Gretna and the sort of recreation that sort of developed whilst the factory was ongoing. So thank you, Stuart.
That's no problem. It's great.
Next, we have Kathy, who is talking about a really fascinating woman that she's been researching, Miss Florence, I'm going to pronounce the name wrong, Catnack, I think. So over to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good morning to everybody. I'm really pleased to be sharing this morning. So yes, I was given Miss F. Catnack 3 months ago. Not a lot was known about her, as Laura said, not even her first name. So yes, she's Florence. Next slide. So yeah, there's this lovely photo of her in the Mossband Farewell magazine with her address of 33 Grosvenor Place, Newcastle on Tyne. So it's from this address, and despite various spellings of her surname, that I was able to do all the research I did, track her family back to Newcastle and Gateshead. And I discovered a dramatic event that her grandparents would have known about. So next slide. In 1854, there were fires and a huge explosion that destroyed central areas of the River Tyne of Gateshead, the central areas around Gateshead and Newcastle, killing 53 people and destroying or damaging many buildings on Newcastle quayside, including the Customs House, which had its roof and windows blown out. Now, 1854 was also the year that Florence's mother was born in Newcastle, and Florence's father, who was born in Gateshead, was just 20 months old, so the two families would have been well aware of the Great Fire. So next slide. Florence's grandfather was a customs officer, and by 1881, Florence's grandparents were actually living in the Customs House on Newcastle quayside, which thankfully had survived the Great Fire. Next. So Florence's father, Charles Burney Catnack, was secretary of the Northern Counties Building Society. And in 1915, the local paper featured him as a notability of the North. He was chairman of the committee of the Royal Victoria School for the Blind and a prominent trustee of the Wesleyan Church. So as you can see, Florence, she was actually the second child of a family of 7 children. She had an older sister, Annie, 3 younger sisters, Margaret, Gertrude and Agnes, and then the 2 younger brothers, Thomas Burney and Charles Burney. So next. So this is the gravestone of Florence's paternal grandparents in Newcastle, and it tells a very sad story. Her father, Charles's family had suffered tragedies. His sister died aged 6 weeks, A brother died age 2, a sister died age 1, and a surviving sister died age 23. Next slide. So Florence's younger brother, Thomas Burney Catnack, was sent to France. He fought at the Battle of Scarpe. And so this is a picture of the first Battle of the Scarpe in April 1917 that shows the conditions at the time. Next. So tragically, Thomas died of wounds in April 1917, aged 23. And it's likely that Florence would have suffered this bereavement while working at Mossband. Next. Florence's sister Agnes, described on entry to the University of London as having a rather silly manner, giggles, but not a bad sort, forged a distinguished career, was president of the Headmistresses Association, was sent by the British Council to Australia for 8 months, and was awarded the CBE. This lovely photograph of her is in the National Portrait Gallery collection, and she came to be described as a leading British educationist. Next. The Catnack family had links with the suffragist movement. So around 1911-12, a Miss Catnack, possibly a sister Margaret, was involved in the suffragist movement. She gave a short speech at the Newcastle branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and also in distributing literature around Hexham, with a great deal of quiet propaganda work done, despite the appalling rain. And in 1915, Florence's mother donated funds to the Free Church League for Women's Suffrage to help equip and maintain hospital units in France and Serbia. So these pioneering units were organised by the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and they were fully equipped and entirely managed by women. Next. So as chief supervisor at Mossband, Florence would have worked at the central offices pictured here. The supervision and care of 11,000 girl workers fell to educated, trained women in a women's department, and this was an important business section of the factory. Florence was responsible for 30 shift supervisors, matrons, and sub-storekeepers. She received daily reports from all her supervisors and had to send a weekly report to her chief assistant, highlighting any matters needing attention. So this was a responsible role for a young woman in her mid-30s. Next. So after Gretna, Florence lived in Bourneville, Birmingham for at least 17 years, mostly at St George's Court, pictured here, which provided homes for single professional women. Bourneville was created by George Cadbury as part of the Garden City movement, and I think there are similarities here with the design of the townships for the munitions factory. Perhaps the community feel of it felt very familiar to Florence after Mossband. Florence was working in the chocolate factory as welfare superintendent, and by 1939 as personnel manager at Girls' Office. Florence was secretary of the Birmingham branch of the Welfare Workers Association, which later became the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. Next. Adventurous stuff. So in 1928, Florence set sail from Liverpool to New York on the White Star Line Celtic ship, returning over a month later from Quebec to Liverpool. Her companion was Phyllis Bruce Muscott, who also worked at Cadbury's. Next. So this is Cadbury's 1931 centenary celebrations, attended by 20,000 people. Florence and Phyllis, her companion on her visit over the pond, won a prize in a fancy dress competition. The two were dressed as Minnehaha and Hiawatha. So Florence moves to the eve of the next World War, and the 1939 record of her living at St George's Court reveals that at the age of 57, bless her, she was volunteering for the auxiliary fire service. Next. And yes, chocolate production continued through World War II. It was an essential food for the war effort. And by 1941, a war ration version was made with dried skimmed milk powder.
Oh, God.
Next, finally, sorry, this has probably been a bit long. Finally, we track Florence to Eastbourne. Florence was the first sister to move there, where Sister Agnes CBE sometimes visited and gave talks. So in this photo, we've got Gertrude on the left, sister, then Sister Agnes, and then Florence is the third from the left. At that time, Florence was also a member of the Eastbourne branch of the National Council of Women and was involved in fundraising activities. And actually all three spinster sisters spent their latter years in Eastbourne, and Florence lived to the grand age of 87. And no other family photo has been found yet other than Dixie. So next slide. Meet Dixie, Florence's brother's beloved Rover car. So Charles Burney Catnach Jr. died in 1962, and the car was passed on through the family. So it's amazing that from that one single address, I've been able to draw up a family tree for Florence, spanning 6 generations. It's been absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for that incredible talk. And just, again, it just shows how sort of vast this research is, and your research in particular, in uncovering this fascinating family story. Judith has a question actually in the chat. She says, I wonder where her reports are now, destroyed, or do you think they might be in an archive somewhere? Do you have any idea, Kathy?
I don't know about that. That's certainly something I'd like to look into. That would be really interesting to try and find out. It's like any other research, what you find just raises other questions. There are also gaps in my knowledge about her life. So yeah, there's still more to do.
Yes, definitely. It's all, yeah, I completely agree with you with that. There's always more questions, more things to uncover.
Yeah.
Kathy, oh, there's one more slide, I think.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's interesting that her final her words in the Mossband Farewell magazine. The pure, oh, I won't read it out because you can have a look at that. But it seemed quite prophetic when you think of what I found out about her life beyond that time. That everybody's experience as Gretna formed them for the rest of their lives. It wasn't just their time at Gretna; it went beyond. And I think what I found out about her life proved that. Thank you.
We next move on to Ali's research, fascinating research again into one of her relatives, Nellie. And Ali can't actually be here today, but she's really kindly sent this PowerPoint, which I will read out for her. Let me just check the chat. Oh, and so I will start. So Nellie is the one standing in this photograph. She's about 19 years old, and she was born in 1895 in Cellardyke, East Fife. Her father was a skipper and owner of a steam drifter, but unfortunately her mother died when she was 15 in 1910. And she lived in a close-knit fishing community, which is interesting because we do have records that that there were quite a few women who worked at Gretna who came from fishing communities, and she had a really strong bond with family and friends. And Ali's research has been absolutely fascinating because she has lots of letters that Nellie wrote, and she's been going through letters that she wrote to family and friends, and Ali is her great niece. So Ali and her best friend Alice left school age 14 as dictated by their parents, and you've got a lovely photo of one of the letters that Nellie wrote. They both wanted to carry on with their education, so they attended evening classes, and they came top one winter with only 1 mark between them. So in this letter that's pictured, which is written in 1995, which is just incredible, that Nellie was still writing letters 1995, Nellie talks of always having longed for the advantage of extra education, which is so poignant, I think, and just illustrative of how the importance placed on education. And part of Ali's research, she's been looking through clues about another friend of her great aunt Nellie, and Alice, her friend, in photographs named only as Auntie May, who she suspected also worked at Gretna. So this is really sort of historical mystery that Ali has been trying to untangle. So sometime in World War I, Nellie and Alice travelled from Fife to become housemaids in a hostel known as Stevenson House in Eastriggs, and this was one of the women's hostels where munitions workers lived. And we've got an excellent picture of Nellie here in her uniform at HM Factory Gretna, and also of Nellie and Alice, who Ali has noticed that were so pleased with the clothes that they made whilst at Gretna. If you've seen some of the other photos of munitions workers, I think this background is pretty familiar and has been used in other photos. So this photograph shows Nellie seated and Alice, who was Ali's grandmother. And this was actually about the time they went to HM Factory Gretna. And in addition to all of these wonderful letters that Nellie had written throughout her life and all the way up to, I think she lived until she was 100, so a huge sort of family archive of letters, Ali also recorded interviews, oral interviews with her aunt Nellie. So this one was recorded in August 1985. Ali says, "Did you work in a munitions factory during the war?" And Nellie says, "The first war where all the girls lived, that was an experience and all." Alison asked, "Nana worked there as well?" Nellie said, we both worked there. Auntie Maggie used to say we were like two pearls on a string. Forgive me for my bad southern butchering of that. We were never separate. So that's, and again, a lovely, great little nugget of social history there. So writing in May 1990, Nellie, which was over 70 years later, recalls a day out with Alice to watch the tide come in at the Solway Firth. So I'll just give you a little, a couple of moments to have a read of this excellent photo. I remember Ali telling me about this, that it was said that the tide comes in so fast, like a galloping horse, that you've never seen it. No one has ever seen it all come in. So they were trying to kind of beat that myth, and unfortunately, they didn't. Determined that we would watch the tide come in. Did we? All at once, Alice said, "Look," and the tide was in. And again, I think that just shows how. Illustrates how wonderful the kind of community of munitions workers and the workers who supported the munitions workers, they kind of brought into these local myths and local traditions, which was really lovely. So in this letter, let me just let somebody else in. In this letter, Nellie talks about writing to the local boys serving in World War I to cheer them up in their appalling conditions. And this is a letter from early 1987, Nellie sending and receiving gifts of handkerchiefs in World War I. And the handkerchiefs Ali showed us a couple of the handkerchiefs, I think, in some of our drop-in sessions, and they're so intricate, like little embroidery all over these handkerchiefs. It's absolutely gorgeous. And this is another photo also of that features Nellie. She's at the front, Nellie and her friend Alice, and then at the back, Tom Smith and Jim Smith, which again I think ties into this, is a part of the people that Ali is trying to put together in her research. She's trying to figure out how all of these people relate to each other. So Nellie had integrity, empathy, and enthusiasm. She thought deeply about life, wit and wisdom shining in her writing. So this letter from 1993, Ellie talks of being up to the eyes with visitors. So she was so loved by her family and friends, and yeah, that sounds lovely. She married in 1926 and made lots of new friends, her pen pals, and she started writing in verse in 1948. So Memories and Reflections was published in 1993 by her niece Joan for Nellie's 98th birthday. So Nellie actually became a published writer in her life, which is great. And the second edition came out in 2018. So as I previously mentioned, Ali was hunting through Nellie's letters to try and find this Auntie May, who she'd also heard from family law had worked at Gretna. And she's discovered through looking through these letters that Auntie May was Mary Alice Wood, who lived from 1898 to 1941. So again, it just shows how incredible volunteers like Ali and like Stuart's identification of these people are, with very little clues, which is absolutely great. Yeah, Nellie lived to be 100 years old. She's laughing there in her at her 100th birthday, this is a great, lovely kind of sign off. My doctor says, have patience. It's all right for him with his young legs. Love to you all, Aunt Nellie. So that is Ali's sort of a summary of Ali's research so far. And again, it shows the diversity of this research project, that we have people like Fiona who are looking through newspaper research and doing genealogical research, and then Ali, who is looking through this fascinating family archive that she's inherited. It's absolutely incredible. So next we have Peter, who is talking about another fascinating person who worked at Gretna, but also is sort of slightly moving us on in a bit, in a way, because he's talking about his grandfather, who was a chemist at Gretna. So over to you, Peter. Oh, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. My grandfather, Harry Marchington Lowe, was born on 5th November 1890 to Francis Voltaire Lowe and Elizabeth Marchington. His father was a painter decorator and his mother had been a teacher. Grandpa became interested in chemistry while mixing paints from raw ore for his father and learning how to improve them. He won a scholarship to Manchester Pupil Teacher College in 1908 and then went on to study chemistry at Manchester University in 1909. He graduated with a BSc in 1912 and studied explosives for his MSc, graduating in 1913. His first job was at Ironhurst Peatworks in Mousfield, where his employers, Wet Carbonizing, were attempting to produce smokeless fuel briquettes from peat. It was a failure and the company went bust. In 1917, the Ministry of War, having realized that the briquettes were particularly suitable for use in the trenches, took over the property and, with the benefit of the experience gained, erected a new plant for the annual production of 60,000 tons of briquettes per year. Grandpa boarded in nearby Clarencefeld, where he met Jessie Munro, a teacher at Ruthwell School, who became my grandmother. In May 1914, Jessie moved to work at Croft Amy School, Stirlingshire. Next slide, please. This shows a portrait of my grandfather in his graduation robes, probably taken in Annan, probably in 1913 or 1914. Next slide, please. Grandpa's second job was at Chance and Hunt, essentially a government munitions factory in Oldbury near Birmingham, researching TNT, which damaged his heart. He worked there from December 1915 to January 1917. Sometime between January and May 1917, he moved to HM Factory Gretna to work on explosives production, and I think he was in charge of mixing the cordite. He told me that he was responsible for a fire at St Pancras that destroyed much of the station. He recommended showers for all explosives workers before they went off shift. However, there were vociferous complaints by the women against taking showers. They were afraid they would be spied upon by the men, and some felt it wasn't natural to wash all over every day. He recommended all explosives workers to be checked before starting to ensure they had no metal items. He said that women would arrive with metal hair slides and hairpins in their hair and be very indignant when told to remove them. He recommended all explosives workers to wear garments without pockets. He recommended all workers mixing chemicals wear a mask covering face and nose. But how true these family stories are, I don't know. I've not found any records of a fire at St Pancras Station during World War I. In July 1917, Jessie Monroe left Croft Amy School, and the following month, she and Harry Lowe were married at Milton, Glasgow. Harry and Jessie lived at G8 Falkland Road, Eastriggs. In October 1918, their first daughter, Mary, was born. I assume from the Dornoch Farewell magazine that Harry's job at Eastriggs just ended sometime in 1919, simply because the magazine lists a Manchester address. His next job was at Dorman Long in Middlesbrough, where he stayed until he retired. He was chief chemist of the byproduct department. One of his processes was tar distillation. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Chemistry and of the Chemical Society in 1946. He devised lots of mathematical puzzles, including Knight's Tours, cross number, and the puzzle now known as Sudoku. I think he called it number fit. And he was a strong chess and draughts player. He died in January 1979. And the important thing about this is that I found it very difficult to do this research, simply because Lowe is such a very common name. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Peter. That again, a fascinating story full of. I love the mix of sort of family stories and your kind of tracing of Harry's life and his jobs. An absolutely fascinating story. Thanks so much for sharing. I think next we have Robin speaking about the police at Gretna, but I don't actually think he's in the meeting. Let me have a look. Robin, if you're here, please feel free to start speaking. Robin's done some great work on police at Gretna. He's particularly interested in the male police. Obviously, there was women police at Gretna, which I think has probably taken much of the historical attention. But Robin's tracing the policing at Gretna, and I don't think he's here. But let me check the chat. His talk on policing at Gretna leads really nicely onto our next speaker, who is also, his research recently has dived into one particular police officer at Gretna who has a very mysterious and hard to trace past. So over to you, John. Oh, you're on mute. Let me unmute you.
Hello, can anybody hear me? Okay, well, I'll assume you can, unless somebody says not. So yes, Dennis O'Connor. Quite a few years ago, before indeed we moved into our present premises in Eastriggs, we were at the other end of the village in an agricultural shed, and a gentleman arrived with some fascinating documents relating to his, I'm not exactly sure what the relationship was, but anyway, relating to Dennis O'Connor, who came from Ireland and joined the factory police force in July 1918. And he presented us with a fair number of documents, which I'm going to show you, but also rather something of a mystery. So if we can have the next slide, please. I mean, Dennis was 50 when he arrived in Gretna, and on the day he was there for what he describes as his confirmation, he sent a postcard to his daughter May. And though this is no relevance to the research, I just think it's a lovely picture of the centre of Carlisle in 1918. So I thought I'd let you have a look at it. So if we could have the back of the next slide, please, which is the back of the postcard. This gives us his address in Dublin. and his daughter's name, Miss May O'Connor, 25 Rialto Street, South Circular Road, Dublin. And the actual wording of the postcard, I think, is fascinating. So he says, enjoying a stroll through the city today after my confirmation. I'm assuming that this was an interview in which it was confirmed that he would join the Gretna police, the factory police force. He says, all expenses paid, so that's obviously important. Plenty of red stone in house and factories, which suggests an interest in architecture, but seems a slightly strange thing to say to your daughter in a very short postcard. And then perhaps more importantly, no spirits, because of course the factory, the drink scheme was, the Carlisle experiment was well underway by then, and he signs it Daddy. Next slide, please. I'm doing my Professor Chris Whitty here. Yes. So this is his identity card. Oh, it's gone rather weird. Anyway, never mind. Which gives us more information. Says he was 50 years old. He was 5'11" tall. He gives his address again. And it's signed by the police inspector, who is a chap called Pearson. And I have identified, I think, who he was. He lived in Hut 9, police quarters in Eastriggs, which is a fascinating piece of information in itself. And I'm disappointed that we didn't get Robin's talk before, because I was hoping he was going to tell us something about the police quarters in Eastriggs, but no doubt we'll find out about that on another occasion. If we could have the next slide, please. So we knew from the information that we'd been provided by Dennis's descendant that very sadly he died in November in Eastriggs, and indeed was buried in Dornoch Cemetery. And we have various items of correspondence between the authorities and his wife, Jane, about where his plot is, or at least the number of his plot, and how much that she had to pay for his interment and for the purchase of the plot in perpetuity. And one of my next items of research is to go and actually try and find and see whether the family was ever able to put a stone over poor Dennis. I found this probate notification, which confirms the date of his death was 26 November 1918. Also that he actually died in hospital at the Gretna hospital, which was of course the factory hospital. We understood that it was from the Spanish flu, which of course was rampant at the end of the war. There's nothing there to confirm that. It also says he died intestate, so poor chap, he wasn't obviously expecting to pop his clogs. And the probate was granted to Jane O'Connor, the widow. So this gives us a lot of insight into where he was before he came to Gretna, because clearly as a 50-year-old, he must have had a career before he suddenly rocks up in the police force. Could we have the next slide, please? So I managed to find a marriage for a Dennis O'Connor and a Jane English. I'm sorry, it's not very easy to read, but it's here. But the important thing is, no, it's almost impossible to read, I'm sorry, but it gives us the name of his parents and her parents. And I thought that was a pretty good launching point. I'd be able to fill in all the information very quickly. However, it turns out to be not quite as straightforward as that. Next slide, please. So we did find, or I did find, a baptism for Dennis O'Connor, and his parents are certainly given as Jeremiah O'Connor and Mary Reardon, which, apart from a different spelling of Reardon, certainly matches in with the marriage lines. Unfortunately, Dennis O'Connor is a bit like John Smith is in England, and it turns out that there were several Dennis O'Connors born in Kerry in 1867, 1866, somewhere around there. And one at least of them has parents, Mary and Jeremiah and Mary. So there has to be a lot of caveats about the information that I've managed to find so far. And those of you who've had experience of researching in Ireland will know that it is really very tricky. Next slide, please.
Oh, slide.
Okay. That wasn't what I wasn't expecting.
Sorry,
right.
Jim.
So sorry, we've got That's the same slide, isn't it?
Yes, in fact, it's not. There's no more slides. I didn't.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what's happened then. Right. Well, there should have been 10 altogether. So I don't know what's happened. Okay. So I'll have to try and manage this because I haven't got the slides up on my own screen. Where have we got it?
John.
So the question really is, what happened to him between that baptism in 1867 and his arrival in Gretna in 1918? So you think, well, it shouldn't be too difficult. There was a 1901 census, there was a 1911 census. The earlier ones are difficult to get hold of in Ireland. So I thought, well, I'll find him in those. I certainly managed to find Jane's sister, Mary English, in the 1901 census. Rather oddly, she's there with her two brothers, and she never married, as far as I can tell. And in the same address in 1911, I find Mary's sister, Jane, who is now married. She's called Jane O'Connor. She's got her two children, including May O'Connor, that the postcard was written to. Still no sign of Dennis. And I'm still not entirely sure where she is in 1901. I did find, rather oddly, a Jane O'Connor living as a boarder, claiming to be a married woman without a job, which certainly suggests she was being supported by Dennis. But interestingly, of course, you may have noticed that she didn't get married until 1909. And as good Roman Catholics in Ireland, that seems a little surprising to me, but there you are, something still to explore. And that's really where I've got to. So we have this gentleman who turns up in Gretna, 50 years old, obviously looking very smart, as you saw from his photograph, and gets accepted as a policeman. And that seems, either I would have expected him to have already been a policeman in Ireland, or it occurs to me he might have been in the forces. And I have discovered that a Dennis O'Connor enlisted in the 101st, oh God, it's all on the slides, never mind. The 101st Foot, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, in 1899. Now, if that's him, then we know that the 101st Foot, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, took ship in 1900 for South Africa and fought in the Second Boer War. Clearly, if he was in South Africa in 1901, that would explain why he wasn't in the 1901 census. And that's really where I'm going with this at the moment. So this is a work in progress, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, John. Again, it just shows the kind of the issues that come up when you're researching historical people and people with common names like Dennis O'Connor, but also just this really interesting mystery of what he was doing before he came to Gretna and then tragically died soon after. So a great exploration of your process of research, and sort of I'm really excited to see if you can find out even more about him. We have a final presentation before our keynote speaker from Dr. Chris Brader, another historical mystery from Beth, who is going to talk to us about who Daddy Henderson was.
Hello, everybody. So I'll have the first slide. So Laura sent me this. It's a page from the unpublished memoir of W.G. Emmett that's held by the Devil's Porridge Museum. And in his memoir, he wrote about his friend, Daddy Henderson. So I'll quickly read it. On most Saturday evenings, I went into Carlisle 10 miles away with Daddy Henderson on the back of my bike. Here he would have a steak and chips meal followed by a variety show at the theatre. Henderson was a Scot in his early 40s, hailing from New Zealand. He was perhaps my closest friend during my Gretna period, a bachelor of sterling character with the highest principles of conduct, clean thoughts, and a canny sense of humor. His friendship was a great support to me while I was getting used to my heavy responsibilities. He got the nickname Daddy as he was some 10 to 15 years older than the run of the staff. After the war, he returned to New Zealand, got married, and had a daughter. I visited him there with Reg in 1952 and found him little changed after 33 years, though he had a weak heart from which he died a few years later. Powfoot was another place we frequently visited, situated on the Solway Firth beyond Annan, with a pleasant golf course good enough for us amateurs. Henderson and Stark from the ether plant usually formed a team with me and another, and after our game we had whiskies on the quiet in a back room of the hotel, as the license did not apply to Sundays. However, we were on very good terms with the hotel manager, a good sport. Annan residents were said to have written to the local paper complaining of our disturbing the Sabbath peace as our motorbikes traversed the town on our way. Little we cared. Next slide. So this is what the memoir told me about Daddy Henderson. And I'll just let you quickly glance through them because I just read them out to you. But there's a few clues there about trying to track down who Daddy was. I knew that he came from New Zealand. He was 10 to 15 years older than most of the staff at the factory. So he would be in his early 40s. He returned to New Zealand after the war. He was visited by Emmett and Stark in 1952. I've just got Fiona's chat getting in my way there. And he was visited by Emmett, who wrote the memoir in 1952, and he died a few years after that. So there's a few clues there. Next slide, please, Laura. So from the Door Knock and Mossbend farewell magazines, there are two Hendersons mentioned. The first one was J.C. Henderson from Langham, and he was from the Danger Building staff. And all the research that I could find out about J.C. Henderson, there was no link at all to New Zealand. So then I focused on the second one, who was for a J. Henderson, and the address that was given was care of Inder, Henderson and Dixon, 1 London Walls Building, London. And this J. Henderson was from the operating staff. So because there was this Henderson mentioned in this business that was the forwarding address that this J. Henderson gave, I decided to look into that to see if there was a family connection. Next slide, please. And the three partners in the business were Clarence John Inder, Donald Douglas Henderson, and James Thompson Dixon. And I found out about the three of them. The photograph on the right is a picture of the London Wall buildings. So I found these three people, and in the course of finding them out, I found out that they were all engineers of some sort or another, and they were either from Australia or from New Zealand. So I thought, well, that's a good thing, because the memoir said that Daddy Henderson was from New Zealand. So it was a good clue that I might be on the right track. But at this moment, I was still no closer to finding out who Daddy Henderson was. Next slide, please. Now the clues came from when I was looking into Donald Douglas Henderson, who was the partner in that business. I found him in the 1911 census, and he was married. So I looked for his marriage, and at the time in 1911, his wife was called Helen. So this was the marriage at the bottom, which was in 1909. And I saw from that at the time of his marriage in 1909, he was a widower. But it also told me that he was, just go back again if you would, he was a civil engineer. So that was a good start. So then I decided to look for his first marriage. And there it was in 1904, the one at the top. And he's down as an electrical engineer. Both of them also tell me that his father was John Henderson. The first marriage was in Scotland, and it also gives his mother's name. And she's down as Christina Henderson, and her single name was Christina Banks. So now I know that Donald Douglas Henderson's father and mother were John and Christina. So that was another clue that I had. So I'll have the next slide now. Thanks, Laura. Now, when I was looking into the engineers for looking at the company of Inder, Henderson, and Dixon, I found this UK mechanical engineer records on Ancestry. And I found Inder listed in there as an engineer. So I thought, well, I'll do a search on this database to see if I can find a Henderson of any kind. And I found a John Henderson. And what caught my eye straight away was on the right-hand side, you'll see there that he was supported in his application to become a member of the UK Mechanical Engineer Company. He was supported by a D Henderson, and that was the same signature as Donald Douglas Henderson. So I thought, right, this must be a family connection. So we'll have the next slide. Now, going back to Donald's second marriage in London in 1909, one of the witnesses is a J. Henderson, and the top signature is his. And then on his application to join the UK Mechanical Engineers, that's his signature. Now, I compared the two and decided in my very non-existent experience of comparing signatures, but to me, it was written by the same man, particularly the E-S-S-O-N, the E-R-S-O-N at the end, to me looked very, very similar. So I thought, right, it must be the same person. So we'll have the next slide. And then I went further with the UK Mechanical Engineer records, and they're quite extensive. And this John Henderson, at the time of his application, was the manager and chief engineer of the British Guiana Gold Company. And his contact details were care of Messrs. Inder and Henderson. So this is the early company that eventually became Inder, Henderson, and Dixon. So going way back, he was connected to that company. So we'll have the next slide. And this is the register where they register the new applications. And you can see on the top one, John Henderson, manager and chief engineer of the British Guiana Gold Company. And then the right-hand side of that page is down at the bottom, and it gives his supporters his date of birth. Again, Rosemary's chat is covering up what I can see. But there, it gives his date of birth as 1876, the 23rd of August, 1876. And that he had query died in 1954. And usually they record a death in this mechanical engineer records, either because they haven't renewed their subscription or because word has come to them that the individual has died. So we'll have the next slide. So who was Daddy Henderson? So now I found out that his name was John. And once I knew that his name was John, I was then able to find out that he was born. The records for the UK Mechanical Engineers said that he was born in 1876, but he was actually, his birth was registered in 1875. He was the son of John and Christina Banks Henderson, which I already knew was the couple that were the parents of Donald Douglas. So now we know that Donald Douglas and John were brothers. And the mechanical engineer records give us a really good description of his history, where he was born, where he was educated, his technical education, his apprenticeship, and then the next slide will shows his career, and it gives his full career up to the time of his application. And all the while you can see he's had connection with the company in London that was the forwarding address that he gave in the Mossband Farewell magazine. So I think that might be the last slide. No, one more slide. But I just wanted to say that I haven't been able to track down his wife yet. I know from travel passenger lists that he traveled in 1921 on a ship and he was down as single. But then in 1923, he traveled again on a ship on his own and he's down as married. So that's narrowed his marriage to between 1921 and 1923. And in New Zealand, between 1921 and 1923 are 3 possible marriages. So I'm still on the trail trying to track down his wife and his 1 daughter. But as a family historian, this was a real challenge for me and one I'm really proud of. And it was just by those signatures that I finally concluded that I tracked down who Daddy Henderson was. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was amazing. And that was some incredible research to go from Daddy Henderson and just like a couple of sort of clues from a memoir to all of this. Absolutely incredible. Well done. And also a great demonstration of just how important and helpful the UK mechanical engineer records can be for research as well. So thank you for that. That was the last of our talks, and I think from volunteers, and I think they really demonstrate just how incredible the research and how diverse the research has been so far in this project. And now we are going to move on to our keynote speaker, Dr. Chris Brader, who is going to talk about his research into munition workers at HM Factory Gretna. So I will put the next, there's another slide for John Henderson. Is that his?
Oh yeah, sorry, that was just to show that he arrived in 1916 to work at the Gretna factory. And there he is, John Henderson. He's a manager, gold mine manager, and he's aged 40. So that was the other in the memoir. He was in his early 40s. Yeah.
So yes, then take it away, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Can I just say, first of all, the absolutely tremendous research going on here. I always like to think that finding out about the history of the Gretna munitions factory is like you've got a massive jigsaw and there's a big problem, you haven't got all the pieces and you need to know the full picture. And then the volunteers come along and they add one more piece to the jigsaw, which is absolutely tremendous. So I'm just full of admiration for the work that you're doing here. And it certainly adds to our knowledge of Gretna Munitions Factory, which was such an important factory during the First World War. So what I'd like to do basically is to look at a few themes via a few pictures to try and put some of this into context, and I hope it'll sort of stimulate it into doing even more research. So the first picture we go to is it was a postcard actually that was sent out in Carlisle in 1917, and it says, "Go on, I'm making shells." I think basically it was a really good idea of how war was changing in respect to the different countries. There, instead of laying eggs, now female hens are going out to wage war and make munitions. And that's a big change, if you like, in the early 20th century, this whole idea of total war, that the whole of the country needs to contribute to the military effort, not just the military themselves, everyone's involved in it. So the citizens work for the war effort as munition workers, for example. Now, to wage war, governments have to keep the whole community on side, and that's very important morale on the home front. The problem is that wartime conditions disrupt the home front, and normality is very difficult to sustain on economic and the social cultural fronts. If you like, politicians say we're fighting for this and that to preserve our country. But the problem is for those politicians that during this time, the whole nation is changing and things are changing. One of the things that are changing is that women are much more publicly visible at this time. To some, that's very unsettling. To others, that's just a natural thing and it's a good thing. So people have different views about what's going on during this time, during the First World War. It's very true to say as well that local communities are absolutely disrupted, and certainly none less than Gretna, where this massive munitions factory is built. Thousands of migrant workers come into the area. It disrupts the local economy and it disrupts local cultural practices. Now, some of the volunteers have already mentioned the complaints from local residents about this and that going on. They are very common. And so to some people, the Gretna Munitions Factory is a very good thing. To other people, it's not such a good thing. There's a diversity of opinion going on here about Gretna. It's important to remember as well that Cumbria in southwest Scotland at this time is still very much a 19th century rural society, with the exception of Carlisle, of course. So the impact of thousands of migrant workers coming into the area is absolutely enormous. Now, when we look at the factory itself, in June 1915, the Ministry of Munitions created the factory to oversee production of armaments. The problem was there weren't enough shells and there were poor quality explosives. Quantity and quality was the problem. So more effective explosives were needed as trench warfare became more and more the reality of the First World War. The army, for example, often fired shells without explosives. They did damage, but they weren't so effective against large numbers of troops. So cordite, which is produced at Gretna, was a smokeless propellant and seen as a much more efficient explosive. The capital expenditure on Gretna amounted to over £9 million. Just think about that at that time in the first part of the 20th century. That's an absolutely phenomenal amount of money. The original estimate had actually been £2 million. In this total, £1 million was spent on roads and railways, £1.3 million on townships of Gretna and Eastwiggs. The coal-fired power station, for example, cost £1.3 million. Around 30,000 workers have been used in constructing the factory, which only took around 9 months from autumn 1915 to spring 1916. Again, a phenomenal amount of work going on there. And as you probably know, the factory was 9 miles in length with an internal railway system of 100 miles with 17 passenger platforms. There were 11 special trains brought in, over 5,000 workers from southwest Scotland and Cumbria, while 4,000 were brought in from the two townships of Gretna and Eastwiggs. At its peak, it was producing around 1,000 tons of cordite a week. Well, the Royal Gunpowder Factory at Waltham Abbey's highest yearly production was 11,000 tons. So Gretna did make a massive contribution to Britain's war effort, and it's probably true to say that without it, Britain may not have won the war. When you come into this project, you probably think, well, why did they build it at Gretna? It's not immediately obvious, is it? It was chosen for a number of reasons, actually. It had a good railway service, but it had been on the main West Coast north-south route, and also the west-east route to Newcastle. This was an essential factor as 600 wagon loads of material arrived daily. Coal supplies, for example, came from Fife and Northumberland and by sea from Wales. The River Esk provided a water supply with around 10 million gallons drawn a day. And being on the west coast, it was also theoretically free from enemy action by land, sea and air. But as an extra precaution, actually, anti-submarine netting was also placed along the Solway as an added precaution. And also, it was not close to any large urban areas, an important point because of the fear of explosions. There were explosions at Gretna, and people did die, as they did in many other munitions factories during this time. There were no national statistics to tell us, to give us a completely true figure of that. Most historians estimated around between 500 and 1,000 munition workers throughout the country died during the First World War. Many more, of course, were injured. That number is still unaccountable, but if you add those on, it was a significantly dangerous job to do, and particularly at Gretna. Can I have the next slide, Laura, please? I love this photograph because to me, it just sums up, in particular, the age of a lot of the women workers at Gretna. If you take a good look at those faces, they are young girls. And we know that the official starting age for people to work at Gretna was 16. We also know that there were some women who were under 16 who joined, who lied about their age and got in because they wanted a lot of people to go and work there. One thing I'm also that you might notice as well, they're all wearing bonnets of a certain style. We'll come back to that later when we look at the idea of the cinema this time. But this is a very young group of girls and they're doing incredibly hard and dangerous work. Gretna was known as Timber Town, basically many of the workers lived in the wooden huts or bungalows, as you'll see in the next slide. If I remember, oh, this is an aerial shot actually of the bungalows. You can see, for those who know Gretna, if you look at the top there, that's the main street. Then coming down towards there, that area now. Well, that's where a lot of the barracks were. Excuse me. Were built. So they lived in, a lot of the workers lived in wooden huts or bungalows. Now, it's true to say that Gretna and Eastwoods, they were purpose-built towns, and they were designed by leading Garden City architects like Raymond Unwin. But these were largely for the skilled workers with families, not the young single female component of the workforce. And ironically, the Garden City designers did not really approve of Gretna in any case, because they thought the government had skimped on the features for the housing. So the jury was out, if you like, on the sort of housing that was provided. A lot of the time it was regarded as first class, very modern, up-to-date housing. So like the construction workers before them, the female workforce was brought in from other parts of the UK and Ireland to supplement the Cumbrian and Southern Scottish workers. So there were Gaelic speakers from the Highlands, daughters of Northeast miners and shipbuilders, Lancashire and Yorkshire textile workers, Welsh speakers. It was a community that suddenly had to come together and learn to live together and to produce munitions. Not an easy thing to achieve. And the evidence is from a lot of the accounts that there are friction there between the workers and cultural friction, if you like, as well. That it's not an easy thing to do to get all these workers to come in from different areas and to integrate and to produce armaments in a smooth way, if you like. So compared to other munitions factories that made shells, filled shells or produced TNT, Gretna had a much younger workforce. That's important to remember. In its 1917 peak, there were around 20,000 employees. 60% of those were female, around 12,000. And 80% of these women were single and 60% were aged 18 and under. Now that's very different from a lot of the other munitions factories throughout the country. You'll notice as well that in the other munitions factories, there were creche facilities. They didn't need them at Gretna because they were largely young women. And that was one of the problems of Gretna's location. They had to import such a large number of people. They couldn't draw them just from the existing populations. That was impossible. So they decided that young, single, mobile women were the ones who would be attracted or encouraged to come to Gretna to work in those facilities. Can I have the next slide, please, Laura? That's a very nice picture, actually, of some of the barracks. You can see that this sort of life is a very militaristic life as well. They look like army barracks, don't they? And if you like, a lot of the women workers were subjected to almost militaristic conditions as well. Judging from the comments of the workers who've been interviewed there, it was very cold in those huts, very cold indeed. And the best place to be was near the stove. If you weren't near the stove, it could get very, very nippy in the middle of winter. One of the other volunteers I know has been looking through the newspaper accounts, which is an absolutely fascinating area because all the local newspapers at that time talk about nothing else but Gretna. So there's a lot going on there. One thing that I noticed was that some of the workers were being prosecuted for theft. And when you look into the cases, what actually happened is it's so damn cold in those huts that workers are coming away from the factory with overalls and jerkins and using them to wear in the barracks, which seems like a pretty sensible thing to me. But they were actually prosecuted for doing this and fined. And some of them were actually warned that they might go to jail if the practices continue, which is a bit over the top reaction, I thought. But it's a good example, if you like, of how newspaper accounts of what's going on. They can really give you an insight into, if you read between the lines, particularly about what's going on there. If you just go to the next slide, please, Laura. I really like this picture as well, because it seems to say to me, when we look back in the past at people's lives, and we talk about people who were working and living there over 100 years ago, that there's this distance between us and them, and they look somehow old-fashioned, but in their terms, they're not. They are the height of modernity in that context. And that picture to me tries to get that idea over that they're living in alongside smart new buildings, and they're quite smartly dressed, notice these women as well. They are, in their terms, living at the height of modernity. It's happening now to them, and we're looking back at them from 100 years or so ago. We have a very different perspective on them. We tend to forget, we think, oh, aren't they old-fashioned? Don't they wear silly clothes? No, they don't. They, in their own terms, are the height of modernity. If you go to the next, I love this picture as well. It's a picture taken of the workers of the nitroglycerine section, probably or arguably the most dangerous part of the factory. And the majority of people who worked there were women workers as well. Most of the women worked in unskilled or semi-skilled jobs, and in the nitroglycerine section of the factory, for example, where the nitroglycerine was prepared and where the cordite was prepared before dispatch. In 1917, around 10,000 women worked in these areas, compared to around about 2,000 males. The factory was, in fact, divided into two administrative sections: Dornoch, the western end, where the mixing of the acids, nitroglycerine and sulfuric acid, for example, and Mossband, where the compounds were brought together to produce cordite. Next slide, please, Laura. And again, this gives you a good example of the camaraderie among women at the factory. They're smiling. You'll notice as well, there were a lot of photographs of Gretna workers taken at this time. It was obviously the thing to do, to be photographed in your work uniform. Presumably, they got time off work actually to do this, because the photographer must have been busy there all the time. I suspect it was probably a Ministry of Munitions photographer or somebody who was licensed to take these photographs came up to Gretna. He must have had a cracking job through the whole of the war, because he never seems to have stopped taking photographs of all the workers there. You can see the badges on display, and the sense I got from looking at the lives of these workers, there's a real sense of camaraderie, particularly among women on the same shift, and they like to differentiate themselves from other workers on different shifts. And part of the idea was to customize the uniform. In other words, even though you're wearing these drab grey overalls, what you did was you customized them to suit yourself. So when you see individual pictures of workers, they often have the bonnets at different angles. They often wear certain types of flowers. It gives them a sense of belonging to each other. And again, to try and put this into context, throughout the whole of the 19th century and the early 20th century, when that shift comes over from women working in service, for example, there's a mass move to factory work. And one of the reasons for that is, well, the pay is obviously better, as it was at Gretna, but when you're working there, the sociability of jobs like that, despite all the hazards, despite all the dangers, despite all the drudgery, is much more prominent than the isolation of women in service as maids and that. And you start getting all these complaints from the upper classes, for example, that you can't get the servants anymore. No, because they've all whizzed off to factory work, because They get to know each other. They get to talk to each other. They get to talk about their lives and everything around them. And it becomes the interesting part of factory work, if you like, despite, as I say, all the drudgery and the danger, etc., etc. Can we have the next slide, please, Lola? This is fantastic again, because it gives you an example. I like to think what it tells you, that these are not just munition workers. These are young women with their own lives, and they don't just see themselves as munition workers. They have a separate life from that. I love the title of Little Miss Munitionette at Home. Notice the phrase as well, munitionette. It becomes part of the novelty at that time that women workers, or women in general, they have to have an "et" attached to their name. So, for example, it comes obviously from a suffragette, but munition workers are munitionettes. Women police are copperettes, and electricians, female electricians, are sparkettes. You'll find that term coming along quite often as well. So everyone's an "et," but the idea of a munitionette becomes a really popular phrase, and it sticks in people's minds. And that's a fantastic drawing, isn't it? I love that picture of her in the bonnet there, and the some sort of wrap around the neck. It really gives an idea of this double dimension of what workers are. They are workers, but they're their own people in their own right as well. Coming to the next slide, please. One of the reasons that people complained about munition workers was the fact that inside the factory, they were great. They were producing all the armaments for Britain. They were helping Britain win the war. Outside the factory, they suddenly become a bit of a nuisance. And as we mentioned before about the newspaper reports about noisy munition workers coming home late at night. I remember there was one example of, I think it was a Presbyterian minister talking about teenage workers coming home late at night in Shallow-banks singing Harry Lauder songs and disrupting the whole community. Well, you do get that. Now, one of the big things that's important, I think, in the First World War for women workers is this whole idea of women in public spaces. And ironically, there are more opportunities for women to get out into those own public spaces during the war. And one of them is access to a cinema. And I cannot stress strongly enough the impact of cinema from the beginning of the 20th century, the impact it had on people's lives. It just seems nothing to us now. It's something we hardly ever think about. But for the people at that time, it was a really big deal. One of the munition workers who was interviewed at that time and talked about her fascination for cinema, what was going on there. You saw things from different parts of the world. You saw people behaving differently, acting differently, etc. So it was like a world on wings, she said. I thought that summed up perfectly the whole idea of the effect that cinema was having on on people. So all the evidence suggests that in World War I, female munition workers attended the cinema in their droves. Everyone commented about it at the time as well. This is indisputable. In the Carlisle and Gretna area, for example, the chance to go to the cinema was actually expanded by the Ministry of Munitions, who provided cinema outlets as well as the commercial outlets. There were already a number of cinemas in Carlisle, but the Ministry of Munitions decided to get into the game as well by producing cinema facilities for their own workers. So Gretna and East Riggs have their own cinemas. And the state management scheme also ran a cinema alongside its public houses at Annan and Longtown. Now, the cinema industry, of course, was absolutely furious about this because they regarded the Ministry of Munitions as a competitor, and they weren't too happy about what was going on during the war. And added to this idea, and you'll find a lot of complaints about this, is state interference in what's going on. And we're not used to this going on. The state shouldn't be doing things like this. They should be keeping their noses out of it. This whole idea of what the state should and shouldn't be doing in the 20th century is one of the main political questions. And it serves as, if you like, in this one example of a state cinema being held in the Gretna area during this time, and the fury of commercial interests correspondingly. It's important to remember as well, the cinema was still a very controversial topic during this period because of the concern of what was being shown. Now, in the First World War, 1914 to 1918, it also coincided with a transformation in film production. In the first decade of the 20th century, cinema goers were treated to a variety of one-reel films which featured comedy routines, travelogues, films of local events and novelty themes. Historians have called this era the cinema of attractions, much akin to a series of variety acts, if you like, which you could see at the music hall. Gradually, films became more complex, more sophisticated, and more plot-driven, if you like. It was at this time as well that when women are flocking to the cinema, and they're allowed to go there by themselves, importantly, as well. These are single-sex spaces now for women. And I can't overstate how important that is, that they're allowed to go there. It might seem strange for them to say, and it's perfectly viable for them to do that. Of course, there are suspicions about them, about what they're doing there as well, but it is a space where they are welcome, and the film industry welcomes them as well, and it projects images of them into the films they produce as well. You can go to the next slide, please, Laura. How am I doing for time? Here's a contrast, if you like, of the sorts of cinemas. This is the interior of a cinema in Carlisle, Stanley Hall. It's the balcony. Notice, it says at the bottom, the balcony is reserved for men only until 7:45 p.m. In other words, women can go to the cinema, but sometimes only in certain areas. It's that touch of exotica about the cinemas that attracted a lot of people. You see those, I don't know whether they're real palm trees or fake palm trees swaying up the stairs there and that whole facade. It gives you the idea of luxury. If you go to the next slide, Laura, please, thank you. That's the cinema at Gretna. That gives you a slightly different prospect of what's going on there. And this is the whole idea of the provision of leisure by the Ministry of Munitions. Yes, you can have leisure. Yes, you can have lots of leisure, but don't enjoy yourselves too much. In other words, be responsible when you're going to places like the cinema. And if you like, architecturally, that building to me says, yes, this is a place of entertainment, but we're very sober and responsible citizens there as well. That's an important message that the Ministry of Munitions gives out at this time. Can we go to the next? I was talking about bonnets before and the way those women workers look. This is Pearl White. I bet no one knows who Pearl White was nowadays. In the First World War, she was arguably one of the top 3 film stars of the period. And you'll know Pearl White from a series of those action films, that The Exploits of Elaine, The Hazards of Helen. It's that whole melodrama thing where a young woman with a male boyfriend or partner is being pursued by someone who's got ulterior motives, either trying to get her money, etc., etc. And Helen or Elaine, in the many guises she appeared, has to battle. She uses a gun as well to fight people off. She's a woman of action. And it's that sort of serial queen melodrama, it's called, that really seemed to strike a chord with women munition workers in particular. It's the look as well, isn't it? Look at the body of that. Pearl White was quite extraordinary because she did her own stunts as well, which is very unusual for that time. But she was extremely popular in Europe during this period, and not least with women munition workers. If we go to the next slide. Apart from the women workers up there, we've also got the example, and it's a pretty incredible example of the women's police service who were stationed up at Gretna during the First World War. The women's police service were, at least the organisers, were largely from the suffragette organisations. I like this postcard because it's, at the time, there were a lot of anti-feminist propaganda going on via the use of the postcard. And the whole idea of women and being policemen was ridiculed at the time. This is one example of the poor old British policeman having to deal with a militant suffragette, and it's the suffragette who's handing out the violence, and the poor old policeman's being clobbered. Of course, the reality was somewhat different, shall we say, but a lot of the suffragettes suffered extremely brutal handling from by the police. But this was one way to pillory the whole idea of the suffragette. We go to the next one. Thanks, Laura. Another postcard from the period says, "What it will come to, when will they be satisfied?" And again, it's the whole idea of making the idea of policewomen ludicrous. I see the rather feminized costume there. Actually, it's a lot better than the actual police uniforms of the time. And amazing picture of the background there of a man in women's clothes. He's even got a little mustache and he's having to look after the children because his wife's going out to be a policewoman. Scandalous. This shouldn't be allowed. That was the anti-feminist argument at the time. And it's amazing how many postcards were produced to get over that image. The postcard was a very important political instrument during this period. Okay, Laura, thank you. This is a picture of the Women's Police Service Act letter. I want to talk very, very briefly, because I'm running out of time, about one of them organisers, Mary Allen. Now, Mary Allen is pictured next to the male commandant to your right. Mary Allen was nothing if not a remarkable woman. She was a leading member of the many suffragette campaigns. She'd led a very sheltered life. When the war came, or at least before the war, when the suffragettes sprang into action, she took to that militant action in a very, very big way. She was imprisoned in Holloway after being found guilty of arson attacks on the derelict house, I believe, and she was force-fed, went on hunger strike, and then released under the infamous Cat and Mouse Act, which allowed prisoners who had been forced-fed to be released when they were well enough, and then as soon as they were well enough to be released, they were brought back inside again. Hence the famous description, the Cat and Mouse Act. Mary Allen, along with several of her colleagues, decided to form the Women's Police Service. This was a very controversial subject, even among suffragettes themselves, largely due to one section of the Defence of the Realm Act. The Defence of the Realm Act at that time actually enabled the government virtually to do anything they said they were going to do. It was a very draconian rule. One of the regulations was 40D of the Defence of the Realm Act, which allowed the police to take into custody any woman they suspected of having venereal disease in a bid to clamp down on wartime prostitution. In effect, what that meant was the police could lift any woman off the streets and march her down to the police station to undergo a test. That was the reality of it. And so for many suffragette organisations, this was one step too far, and they weren't going to get involved in the policing of women in that manner. Mary Allen and her colleagues decided that was a step worth taking in order to get women into a career as a policewoman. So those people who didn't oppose Regulation 40D of the Defence of the Realm Act formed the Women's Police Service. As you might imagine, relationships with the women's police and the munition workers were somewhat strained, shall we say. All the evidence points to the idea that they did not like each other, and a lot of the workers openly mocked the women's police service in many, many different ways. They wouldn't take them seriously, and the women's police service, or at least Mary Allen anyway, is very, very disparaging about working class women as well. They're ill-disciplined, they're coarse, and they won't take command. So there's a lot of friction there going on between the women's police service and the munition workers during this whole period. Can we have the next slide, please? I think we're coming to the end, are we? Oh, can I just brief? It's great when I heard Stuart's research into women's football, because this is very, very important. It's really fascinating subject. There's women who were obviously well versed in, or at least if they were given the opportunity to play football, they would play it. And the phenomenon of women's football in munitions areas during the war is really, really noticeable. what's really noticeable as well is the reservation of the British Munitions Recreation Department, who won't affiliate these football teams into the department. In other words, for some, it's a step too far that women should be playing football. That's really noticeable. That doesn't stop them. And a lot of the football talked about these novelty matches, if you like, between between soldiers, etc., or Navy personnel with their arms tied behind their backs, and all these novelty things. That's done to for war charity. But there's a lot more football going on. The interdepartmental football, actually, that's really, really popular. And despite reservations from the factory, that doesn't stop them, and they do play football, which is great to see. Already some research has been done into the individual members. To me, that's a really important area. So that's fantastic news that someone is doing that. I hope the research goes on even more. So I think we're getting to the end there. So I think before everybody else falls asleep, I think I'll end that there. And thank you very much for listening. And again, I'm really, really encouraged by the amount of research that's being done here. It's absolutely fantastic. Oh, that's the Timbertown Girls bought description in the First World War, which is still available, I believe.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was absolutely brilliant. I think you picked up on so many threads that our researchers are already kind of looking into, and kind of tie them together in such a brilliant way, and showed how all of this kind of munitions workers, police, the impact of cinema, this kind of social relationships all kind of come together at Gretna, which is so interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Chris?
Not so much a question, just an observation. Many of you know my grandmother came over from a very small village in Cumbria to be a secretary at the factory. And I really wonder whether it was just such an opportunity for her. She started life in domestic service. And knowing my grandmother, I can't imagine that really was what she wanted to do, but it would have either been that or farm work. It was a tiny village. So yeah. HM Factory Gretna, for her and for all the other women, must have just been such a huge opportunity that we can't quite appreciate what it was like for them. And for a lot of them, it then meant they went on to find partners, and also, as Dr. Rader said, friendships that they wouldn't have formed otherwise.
I think you're quite right, Fiona. That's an important part of that transition, if you like, from agricultural society into a different type of world. And it's an important point, I think, you make as well about women. They can form many more relationships with other women and with men, of course, as well. And that's an important part of factory work. But I think what it would do, it would open people's eyes up to new realities and new possibilities. And that's one of the attractions of working together with large groups of women. You get to know lots of stuff, basically. Some stuff you might not wish to know, but you do get to know lots of stuff. And that's, how do you do that when you're a servant? It's so isolated. And, you know, when do you get out to meet people? Well, you obviously do. You know, you can overstate this, but working in those conditions and talking to other women as well, finding out about their lives, and it's the requirement of knowledge, if you like, in all sorts of areas. And I think that's a really important part for women during this period.
Me again. I think also what must have been really empowering for them was actually to have a job that was responsible, and to have people listen to their opinions and ideas and take orders, whether they liked it or not from them. For those of us that started work even 20, 30 years ago, you were often just dismissed. I used to go to meetings and get asked to make the tea and coffee, even when I was there as the IT consultant. I can't imagine what it was like for my grandmother's generation.
I'm sure that's true. I mean, note as well that when you see comments about munition workers, the most common phrase that's used is girl. And a girl covers anyone from 5 years old to 95 years old. They're still girls. And there were people complaining about girls won't know what to do in factories. Well, they did, because a lot of them worked in factories before. And even if they hadn't, you could soon adapt to it. One of the problems as well, of course, was this whole idea of apprenticeships at the time. And to have this skill, you have to work 7, 8, 9, 10 years before you become fully qualified. And women coming into these areas and doing those jobs suddenly raised a very different type of question. Well, you know, does it take that long? And what is skill and what is not skill? Important to remember as well that when we talk about women going to work during the First World War, well, women have always worked, and they did before the First World War. We shouldn't forget that. Even if it was paid work or unpaid work, the majority of women have always worked. So we can get a bit distorted, if you like, this idea this was a new world of work for women. Well, it was a new area of work, but work wasn't new for women by any stretch of imagination.
And I think the fact that the nature of the work they were doing, the kind of danger, or as Jenny was saying, must have really, like, that bond together, sort of must have just been absolutely kind of incredible. The fact that you're all going through this kind of dangerous, you're all on, like, doing this together.
I think so as well. I mean, if you like, it's that sense of danger that people have at that time, but it's a shared danger as well, isn't it? I'm sure that must have been a real comfort, you know, for you're not going into this, you know, individually. It's a shared danger. And I suspect in some ways that offset the actual reality of what might happen to you. You might literally get blown up, you know, but knowing that other people are sharing that danger, you know, that must have had a tremendous bond among people for them to share that, you know. So but I think that's another important aspect, definitely.
We've got a question from Kathy in the chat. She says, according to the factory manual, socialising between girls and management staff was encouraged through dances, concerts, plays and football. How successful do you think this was, as you've mentioned, the inevitable friction and tensions?
Well, I think in some ways it did break it down. And what we do know is those dances are incredibly popular and they're incredibly lively and they're incredibly noisy. So people from different cultures did eventually learn to live together. So, I mean, that's an important point. There obviously was friction there and there was conflict there because there are a lot of fights, if you like, between different women from different areas as well. One woman got annoyed because all the Welsh speakers used to speak in Welsh and she knew they spoke English, but they were just conversing among themselves and it annoyed her. Different ways of doing things, but it did break down. I'll give you an example of that from a newspaper account. It was a newspaper account of a theft where these 3 munition workers had nicked something from a grocer's. It was something trivial anyway. But what it was, they gave their addresses and where they were from. But they were all from different areas. They'd obviously originally come to Gretna and then moved in together into these lodges. And I think there were a couple of girls from the northeast, one local woman and someone from Yorkshire as well. So to me, I thought, well, you know, that showed that, you know, that women from different areas did eventually learn to live together, choose their own pals, and they might not have been from their original area, but they did get along, you know, so I thought that was interesting.
Definitely, yeah. And sort of moving on from that, the fact, like, that there are so many accounts of people meeting their future spouses at Gretna. We actually a couple of weeks ago found out, I don't know whether you know this, Chris, that the inventor of Vegemite, an Australian man, worked at Gretna, and from reading the biography written on him by his grandson, he met his wife who was also working there at
Right.
And that sort of Judith, our museum manager, did a great exhibition, I think last year or the year before, and about love in wartime and how this sort of, it almost became like a meeting place, like a
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the suspicions of people who did work the fact about what's going on up there with all these young men and young women, you know, working together. What on earth is happening? And people did say that. And those munition workers viewed from people outside that area were often treated with mistrust. A lot of wild stories. I remember reading one newspaper article in the Newcastle paper where it claimed there was an orgy of fur coat buying, as though munition workers were, sort of swanning around in fur coats and which is just ridiculous. But those urban myths, if you like, because women workers were ostensibly paid a lot more than they would have been before the war. I mean, we're talking about a normal wage would be about 30 pence a week, and they were coming here and earning, if they worked overtime, between £1 and £2 a week. Well, that's a heck of a rise. But when you look at it, I mean, after the board and food's been taken away, that wage doesn't look that brilliant. And a lot of women, of course, send postal orders back home to the families as well. So they do, compared to before the war, they do have a tiny amount of surplus money, which they might have spent on themselves, but all of it goes towards helping the family. So this whole myth of sort of, munition workers living it up while other people are dying in the trenches, that was what often said, you've got a group of workers who are, so they're getting paid phenomenal amounts, and my brother and my mate has been killed in the trenches, and, so it promoted that conflict, if you like, between them, which was hard to dispel as well.
We've got another question in the chat from Rosemary, who asks how many women at Gretna factory had babies during the war. And John's actually just said that there was a maternity hostel on Victory Avenue in Gretna.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I can tell you what's happening nationally, because there was a real panic about what was going on, there had been an explosion of illegitimate births at that time. But when you look at the records, the numbers only go up slightly, which for that period during the First World War is absolutely amazing. So people aren't running around in the streets going berserk, and doing things they wouldn't normally do. It's easy to imagine that's happening, but the reality is somewhat different. But I mean, what we're talking about here is that the majority of people, they're looking for a girlfriend or a boyfriend, etc., and to form a relationship. And in that respect, Gretna actually plays a big part in enabling that to happen, rather than if you live somewhere in the back of beyond in a village where there's maybe 70 people, your marriageable partners in that area are likely to be rather limited. Isn't that a reason to go to work to Gretna and meet new people?
Oh, Rosemary's follow-up question. How many women married whilst at Gretna and then had babies? Did they leave the factory, I'm guessing, after marriage?
Well, that would be, I don't know the answer to that, but that would be an absolutely really interesting area to see what happened to people after the war. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. Aside from that as well, I mean, when I'm giving talks like this, I often get people coming up to me and telling me their grandmother or great-grandmother worked and they suffered illness after the war, miscarriages, or damage to internal organs, or died young. I mean, these are all generalities, and you can't say that, working there did affect A or B on you, but clearly some people were affected because of the conditions, and there were hazardous conditions, and nitric acid, sulfuric acid swirling around, get inside your internal organs. It's not a good idea, is it, basically, in the end. But that's a really fascinating area that would be great to find out what happened to those people after they left. Where did they go to? What happened to them? Did they lead long lives or what?
Yeah, and it's interesting, I suppose, especially when you think about the younger demographic of workers. Interesting to sort of the fact there was a maternity hostel and but there wasn't a creche like other factories, which is really interesting.
Sorry, I missed that last bit, Laura. The sound went on that.
Oh, sorry. I just said that it's interesting, given that the younger demographic at Gretna, and the fact that there was a maternity hostel, but there wasn't a creche.
No, precisely. Yeah.
The interesting dynamic, I think. Oh, Judith's written saying a visitor came in believing that their mother or grandmother may have experienced stillbirths because of her work at the station factory. And I've seen actually in our archival holdings, and when people have come in the past, there's a lot of kind of like attributing stillbirths, miscarriages, and later ill health to Gretna, which is it's such a tragic, and it's so sad, and it's another interesting area of research that maybe
definitely there's no doubt about that. One thing that I thought about afterwards, which might be worth looking into, but it'd be very difficult area to look into, is the environmental effect of the factory. Current concerns about that. And I only came across one reference when I was doing my research about the effect. And it was from Hansard, and it was applied by Lloyd George, the consummate politician, of course, who thrived in today's age as well. It was, I can't remember who he was, but it was a local landowner, obviously, and he expressed concern about the fishing in the area around Gretna. In other words, the effect it was having on his land and the fishing rights and that. And Lloyd George stood up in Parliament and said, there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Gretna is having a detrimental effect on the environment in that area. And he was quite right, simply because there had been no inquiry about what the effects were anyway. So no one knew. But when you think about actually all that effluent of that pouring into the river Esk, what was going on there, so what would be the environmental, some consequences of that? It's a very hard area to investigate, but very interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of the same with the health impact as well, because we've had people say that their eyeballs went yellow and they went yellow. And I did a little bit of research into the effects of cordite, because I normally associate the Canary Girls, as they're called, with TNT. But it's very sparse kind of research information on the actual kind of, because people were chewing cordite and
that's right.
and using it to light their Judith actually mentioned on the chat that the MOD are doing a site survey of the former factory site right now, so hopefully we can try and get access to the results. I think we're coming close to the end of our mini conference. Thank you so much, Chris. That was an absolutely brilliant talk, and really kind of it's so inspiring to hear everybody's research and then have it all kind of brought together, and sort of it always sparks interest in me, like there's potential more research topics to explore, which is great. Marilyn's actually said in the chat that someone recently told me that her aunt lost her hair after working at Gretna, and it's just such a complex and interesting area. Yes, thank you so much to Chris for speaking, and thank you to our other volunteers for speaking as well and sharing their incredible research and the processes that went behind that research. It really sort of shows how the stories and the histories that this project is uncovering is so important, and adding so much to our understanding of HM Factory Gretna and this area during World War One. So yes, thank you so much for coming today. A massive thank you also to Judith, our museum manager, for supporting and helping us organise. We've got some great comments in the chat saying that there are fascinating autopsy reports for women working at the Lancashire munitions factories from Gretna, which sounds absolutely incredible. That'd be something to look into. But yes, so thank you so much. It's been a great morning. So thank you for everybody for attending, and I'll be editing the recording and putting it on our YouTube channel soon, so we'll share that with you all as well if you missed any of the talks. And I know a couple of people had sound issues, so you'll be able to catch up then. So yes, thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your Saturday.